Hey crafters, thanks for joining me. Today we're going to make a masculine mixed media card, and it's perfect for Father's Day. Hope you enjoy. So I started with a piece of card that is 4 3/4 inches by 6 3/4 inches. And I'm going to use some broken china distress oxide in the middle here. My finished card will be 5 by 7 inches, but I wanted to have a black border around the outside. Now I'm coming in with some faded jeans, and I'm going to blend that around the broken china. And I wanted to stick to a blue theme here, so I have 3 different shades of blue, but you could always change this color scheme if you prefer. And once I'm happy with that, I'll go in with my third blue. This is chipped sapphire distress oxide, and I'll blend this around the outside of the card. Chipped sapphire is one of my favorite colors. I have it in the distress ink as well as the distress oxide. That's how much I love it. And I'm going to blend those together. Now you'll notice that I switch back and forth between the different ink blending tools. I don't often show these, but I do have 4 different ink blenders because I find it easier when you're working on a project to have a different ink blender for each color. That way you can go back and forth like I'm doing here. And I'll just continue this until I have a nice smooth gradient. And once I'm happy with the blending, I'll let this dry completely before I add any medium on top. So I'm going to use this stencil. This is called Micro Dots, and it's from Funky Fossil Designs. And I'm just using some transfer gel in random places on the stencil, and it gives you a really neat effect here. And then I'm going to move my stencil to the other side of the card and repeat this. And I prefer using my Make Art Station when I'm using a stencil because I can use those magnets to hold everything in place. And you can see the texture that the stencil gives you. It's just amazing. Now the transfer gel allows us to add foil to the card really easily. So I want to add a little bit more foil by having one of my stamped images foiled. So the stamped image that I'm going to use is from the Funky Fossil set. This is called Guitar Hero, and there's lots of beautiful stamps. And I'm going to just use some of that transfer gel and spread it thinly onto my work surface, and then put my stamp directly into that. And it is a wet medium, so you don't want to push too hard. And then once you've stamped it, just make sure you wash your stamp completely. And I'll let both of these surfaces dry before moving on to the next stage. Now meanwhile, I'm going to create some shrink plastic shapes. So I'm using this black shrink plastic, and it has a rough side and a smooth side. So I'm going to stamp on the rough side, and I'm going to use some VersaFine. So I just used a bit of my anti-static powder first, and then I'll stamp this guitar with the clear VersaFine ink. And then I'm going to remove this and put some sparkly embossing powder on top. And now I'm just going to carefully cut out the guitar. And this is probably the hardest part of making this card because it's very difficult when you haven't set that embossing powder. You don't want to accidentally knock it with your scissors. So just take your time and cut it out slowly. And by using that embossing powder and the VersaFine on the shrink plastic, it gives you a really fun holographic feel, which you'll see shortly. So I'm going to continue this and make a few more guitars, and I used 5 altogether. And when I use my shrink plastic, I like to use the Sizzix tools to hold them in place. And I'll just use my Ranger heat tool to warm up the plastic. And you'll see it shrinks and then it coils and uncoils. And this tool is very handy because you can stamp it and make sure it's flat. And then gently peel it off. And because you've stamped the tool, it's a good idea to just heat it quickly, and that will make the embossing powder shine again. Now you could also use the white shrink plastic, but you won't get as nice of effect using the embossing powder. So here are the finished guitars, which look perfect for an embellishment on the card. So I'm going to use a few more of those guitars and heat emboss them on a bit of black card. So I'll just use my anti-static bag first, and then I'll stamp each guitar with the VersaFine clear ink. And I'll just make sure that I have enough room around the guitars to cut them out with a little black border around them. So I'm going to have 3 guitars all together, and also a little sentiment that says, "You rock." And then once those are stamped, I'll use some white embossing powder and then heat set it with my heat tool. And once those are heat set, I'll cut them out and put them aside for later. So once the transfer gel is completely dry, you'll see that it goes clear on the card. So now you can use it with some deco foil. And I'm going to be using my die cutting machine for this, but you could also use it through a laminator. And you just need to put it in between your plates on your die cutting machine and run it through. And then carefully peel the foil off to reveal the beautiful foil. So easy, but so beautiful. And you can see that stamped image works perfectly as well. And if you have large scraps of that foil, you can always keep it for another project. Now I also went ahead and die cut some letters that spell Dad. You could always customize this for the recipient on your card as well. And I used some holographic paper that I had in my stash. Now I wanted to put a little bit more texture on this card, so I'm going to use the same stencil again, the micro dot stencil, but instead of using the transfer foil, I'm going to use some distress texture paste, and this will give us some nice height on the card as well. This is the matte texture paste, and I'm going to put it in random areas around the card. And I tried to avoid the deco foil, the transfer gel in the foil, but it doesn't really matter. You can place it wherever you like. Now before this texture paste dries, I'm going to add a little bit of color to it. So to do that, I'm going to use some distress embossing glazes. And I used 3 different colors of embossing glaze. So I used the broken china, the cracked pistachio, and the tattered rose. And I just put these randomly around the card over the texture paste. Now once I'd put a bit of color around the card, I'm just going to tap off the excess and then cover up any areas that I may have missed. And adding that embossing glaze will give another dimension to the card. It will dry slightly shiny, but a different type of shininess than the foil. So it's really interesting to see the contrast on the finished card. Now before heat setting this, I will let the texture paste dry for about an hour or so. And you can see this is how it starts out, But once I start heat setting this, the texture paste and the embossing powder, the embossing glaze, will start to shine, and it gives a really nice effect. Now you could always heat the texture paste right away after you've put it down, and it will give you a really nice bubbly texture. But I didn't want that on this card. Also make sure you don't heat the foil with your heat tool or it may start to melt. So now that that's finished, I'm going to assemble my card. I'm going to start by putting those shrink plastic guitars around the center in sort of a mandala-like position. And then I'll add on my letters. Now I have put some foam squares on the back of all the guitars, as well as the star and the sentiment, just to give a little bit of height to those. So once I'm happy with where everything is placed, I'll remove the backing paper on the foam squares and put them in place. And I did use some glue on the shrink plastic and also where that sentiment sits, because it's right on top of the texture paste. The letters I put down with glue as well, but everything else has foam squares behind it. And then I'll glue the whole thing onto a 5 by 7 inch piece of black card. Now for the inside of my card, I'm just going to stamp one of those guitars, and I'm going to use some Faded Jeans Distress Oxide for this. I just love these guitar stamps, and I just couldn't resist putting another one on the inside. And once I'm happy with that, I will glue the card front onto my card base. And my finished card is 5 by 7 inches. Now you can see these stamp sets are perfect for masculine cards or for anyone who loves music and instruments. So here's the finished card with the guitar on the inside. And all that texture and shine is just beautiful in real life. Now I also made another card with a similar theme, but different colors. And this is the slimline version. And you can see this one is more generic, but equally lovely. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video inspiring. Be sure to subscribe so that you're notified whenever I post a new video. Have a crafty day!